Hannibal was wholly gripped by irrational and uncontrollable anger, and that is why he ignored the true causes and resorted to implausible pretexts. This is typical of those who let deep-seated emotions override the appropriate response. How much better would it have been to insist on the return of Sardinia and of the extra indemnity which the Romans had opportunistically and unjustly exacted from the Carthaginians earlier. He should have threatened war if the Romans refused to comply with this demand. But he made not the slightest mention of any genuine grievance and invented a non-existent one about Sargantum instead, which was not only implausible, but more importantly, meant that he seemed to have no just cause for initiating war. Now, the Roman ambassadors knew for a fact that war was inevitable. They sailed to Carthage to deliver much the same deposition to the authorities there as well. But they expressed the war to take place in Iberia, with Saguntum as their headquarters, not in Italy. Given this assumption of theirs, it was perfectly logical for the Senate to decide to secure Illyria. They foresaw a major, prolonged war with Carthage far from home. Demetrius of Pharos had chosen to ignore all the benefits that had come his way in the past from the Romans, and at the same time had come to consider them no danger, insofar as at first they had been busy responding to the threat of the Gauls, and were now occupied with the Carthaginians. Demetrius had become close to Antigonus Doson during the Cleomenian War. Cleomenian War, when they had been allies, and now he was completely dependent on the Macedonian dynasty. At the time in question, he was pillaging and destroying the Illyrian communities that had submitted to Rome, and he had also taken 50 limboi past Lissus, which was forbidden by the treaty, and raided a number of the Cycladic islands. Under these circumstances, and in view of the fact that the Macedonian dynasty was flourishing, the Romans wanted to secure the lands east of Italy. They felt sure that they would have time to chastise the Illyrians for their villainy, teach Demetrius a lesson about gratitude, and punish his impetuosity. Impetuosity. But this was not the way things turned out. Hannibal preempted them by taking Saguntum, and this is why the war took place all over Italy, even close to Rome itself, rather than in Iberia. But since the Romans had good reasons, in the early summer of the first year of the 140th Olympiad, they sent an army commanded by Lucius Aemilius Paulus to deal with matters in Illyria. Meanwhile, Hannibal took to the field and advanced from New Carthage towards Saguntum. The city lies about 7 stades from the coast, on a seaward tending spur of the mountain range that forms the border between Iberia and Celtiberia. The farmland in its domain is good for every kind of crop and is the most fertile agricultural land in Iberia. Hannibal took up a position by the city and put it under a close siege, since he foresaw a number of advantages if it fell to him. First, he thought he would deny the Romans any prospect of making Iberia the site of war. Second, he was convinced that he would intimidate all the Iberian tribes so that those who had already submitted to him would become more tractable, and those who were still independent, would be more cautious. But the most important consideration was that he could then advance in safety with no enemy left in his rear. In addition, he expected to gain sufficient funds for his mission, raise the army's morale by making sure that every soldier got his share of the booty, and win the support of the Carthaginians at home by sending spoils back to them. So there were plenty of reasons for him to prosecute the siege forcefully. Sometimes he set the men a good example by taking part personally in the dirty work of the siege, and at other times he could be found urging them on and hurling himself recklessly into the fray. Eventually, after 8 months of nothing but hardship and tensions, the city fell to him, and he gained a great deal of booty, money, men, and goods. The money was set aside for his own purposes, as he had intended. The prisoners were distributed amongst his men according to their deserts, and the goods were immediately shipped to the Carthaginians back home. Things turned out exactly as he had expected. He had achieved exactly what he had set out to do. He raised the morale of his men so that they were more ready to face danger. He made the Carthaginians compliant to his wishes, and the funds he set aside subsequently proved very useful to him personally on a number of occasions. Demetrius, meanwhile, had heard of the Romans' plans and responded immediately. He sent a sizable garrison to Demale with appropriate supplies and equipment, and posted an elite force of his 6,000 best soldiers in Pharaoh's town. Under his command, elsewhere, he eliminated his political opponents and gave positions of power to his friends. When Emilius reached Illyria with his forces, he could see how secure his opponents felt in Demale, with its combination of natural strength and good fortifications. They thought the city was impregnable, and so he decided to make it his first objective in order to break the enemy's spirits. He assigned the officers in command of the various units of his army their tasks, brought up engines against several stretches of the well, and the siege began. Within 7 days, the city fell. The enemy's morale immediately plummeted, and emissaries came from all over to surrender and pledge allegiance to Rome. Emilius accepted their petitions on suitable terms, and then sailed to Pharaoh's town to attack Demetrius himself. But a siege, he suspected, would be difficult and protracted because of the city's good natural defenses, the excellence of the troops there, and the fact that it was well stocked with provisions and equipment. In view of all this, he adopted tactics that suited the situation. He sailed under cover of darkness to the island with his whole army. After disembarking most of his men in some wooded glens, he sailed at daybreak, in plain view, towards the nearest harbor city, towards the harbor nearest the city with 20 ships. When Demetrius saw their paltry numbers, he sailed out of the city toward the harbor to stop the Romans' landing. The fighting quickly became intense, and more troops poured out of the city to help until Demetrius' entire force had committed itself. At this junction, the Romans who had landed the previous night came up. They had made their way along scheduled trails and now occupied a steep hill between the city and the harbor. In view of the fact that his men were cut off from the city, Demetrius gave up trying to stop the Romans' landing. He had his troops form up, gave them their orders, and urged them forward. He had decided to risk a phalanx battle against those who were occupying the hill. The Illyrians advanced resolutely and in good order under the gaze of the Roman forces, who then made a terrifying charge down the slope against the enemy companies. The Romans, who had just disembarked, saw what was happening and launched a simultaneous attack to the Ilians' rear. With the Romans coming at them from all directions, the Illyrians were thrown into considerable confusion and disorder. They soon found themselves in trouble, front and rear, and the battle ended in a general rout. Some made for the city, and most of them scattered across country over the island. Demetrius had some limboy waiting at anchor in a remote cove in case something like this happened, and that is where he and his entourage retreated. They boarded Limboy and shipped out after dark. By an extraordinary stroke of luck, he made it safely across the mainland and fetched up at the court of King Philip V, where he stayed for the rest of his life. He was a man of courage and daring, but completely lacked the ability to think clearly or to make reasonable assessments of situations. And so his death was in keeping and the general tendency of his life. With Philip's approval, he made an ill-advised and reckless attempt to take Messene and died in the course of the fighting. I shall give a thorough account of this episode when I reach the appropriate date. Aemilius, the Roman consul, took Pharos town straight away with a single assault and razed it to the ground. By the time he had subdued the rest of Illyria and had arranged matters there as he saw fit, it was late summer and he returned to Rome. He entered the city in triumph, acclaimed by the entire population for his competent and courageous handling of the situation. When the Romans heard the fall of Saguntum, they most certainly did not hold a war council, as some historians claim, who even go to absurd lengths of giving detailed versions of the speeches that were delivered for and against the motion. Why would the Romans assemble to debate whether or not they should go to war after the Carthaginian capture of Saguntum, when a year earlier they had threatened the Carthaginians with war if they were merely set foot on Saguntan territory? And how could these writers portray the proceedings of the Senate, making them out to be remarkable for their gloom, and at the same time claim that fathers brought their teenage sons to the Senate, and that these lads listened to the debate and then divulged not a word of the confidential proceedings to any of their friends or family? All of this is as implausible as it is untrue, unless, of course, one of the gifts with which fortune had blessed the Romans is that every one of them is born wise. But I need say no more about the work of the writers such as Cares and Sozilus. Their work seems to me to have the status and importance of the common gossip of the barber's shop. It's not history. When news reached Rome of the disaster at Saguntum, the Romans wasted no time, but immediately chose envoys and sent them off to Carthage. The envoys were to offer the Carthaginians two choices, one of which was unlikely. Two envoys were sent to the Carthaginians to Two envoys were to offer the Carthaginians two choices, one of which was likely to humiliate them if they accepted it and damaged their interest, while the other would probably trigger major warfare and conflict. They were to demand that the Carthaginians surrender their general, Hannibal, along with the members of the council that were attending him, and if they refused, they were to declare war. So the Romans went to Carthage, obtained an audience with the council, and carried out their mission. The Carthaginians were furious at being offered an ultimatum, but they had their most able speakers step forward to justify their actions. They refused to discuss the treaty with Hasdrubal, which they regarded either as non-existent or as existent but irrelevant to them. Since it had entered the room without their approval, they cited the Romans themselves as a precedent for this, arguing that the treaty that had been drawn up at the end of the Sicilian War by by Lutatius had subsequently been repudiated by the Roman people, even though it had been confirmed by Lutatius on the grounds it had been drafted without their approval, and the main insistently repeated plank of their defense was the last treaty there had been between them. The one that had been drawn up at the end of the Sicilian War, they argued, first, that this treaty made no reference to Iberia, and second, that while it expressly made each side's allies immune from attacks from they argued first that this treaty made no references to Iberia, and second, that while it expressly made each side's allies immune from attacks by the other side, the Saguntans had not been Roman allies at the time of the treaty. They supported their argument by having the agreement read out several times. The Romans refused to recognize any attempt at justification. They said that while Saguntum had remained intact, justification had been a theoretical possibility, and the dispute might have been settled by words alone, but that the violation of the treaty changed things. Now, they said, the Carthaginians must either surrender those responsible, which would show the world that they were not guilty of the crime and that it had been committed without their approval, or if they refused, which would be to admit their guilt, they would have to accept war. Both sides relied on fairly abstract arguments, but I think I should go into the matter in more detail. There are two groups of people for whom this is important. First, there are professional politicians who need precise knowledge of these things if they're to avoid making mistakes during critical debates. Second, there are students of history who need accurate information if they are to avoid being misled by the ignorance and bias of the authors they read. There should be there should then be some definitive survey of the contractual obligations of Rome and Carthage in relation to each other from the earliest times up until today. The first treaty then between Rome and Carthage dates from the consulship of Lucius Junius Brutus and Marcus Horatius, the first consuls after the dissolution of the monarchy. And the founders of this sanctuary of Capitoline Jupiter, that is dates from 28 years before Xerxes' invasion of Greece. What follows is as accurate as a translation as I can manage, but there is such a huge difference between the modern and ancient versions of Latin that even experts can scarcely understand some of the ancient language, however long they spend it. Anyway, the treaty reads more or less as follows. There shall be friendship on the following conditions between the Romans and their allies, and the Carthaginians and their allies. Neither the Romans nor their allies shall sail beyond Cape Fair unless compelled by bad weather or hostile actions, but even one who is driven beyond it against his will shall neither purchase nor take anything except for the purpose of repairing a vessel or performing a sacrifice. No Roman coming to sell merchandise shall conclude any transaction unless there is a town crier or town clerk present. The price of everything sold in their presence shall be underwritten for the vendor by the state. If the sale takes place in Libya or Sardinia, within Carthaginian territories in Sicily, any Roman shall enjoy the same rights as anyone else. The Carthaginians shall not harm the communities of Ardea, Antium, Lavinium, Circe, Tarracina, or any other Latin community subject to Rome. Any Latin communities that are not subject to Rome shall remain inviolate, and any such community taken by the Carthaginians shall be surrendered to the Romans unharmed. Carthaginians shall build no fortress in Latium. If the Carthaginians come to Latin territory for hostile purposes, they shall not spend the night there. Cape Fair is the one that lies north of the city of Carthage. The Carthaginians forbade the Romans to sail with warships under any circumstances beyond this headland to the south. The reason being, in my opinion, that they did not want the Romans to become acquainted with the Byzantius region or the Lesser Syrtis region, which the Carthaginians call Emporia because of the fertility of the soil. However, if someone was driven beyond the Cape against his will by bad weather or hostile action, he was allowed to take what he needed for a sacrifice or for repairing a ship, but nothing else, and anyone who landed there had to leave within 5 days. But Roman merchants were allowed to visit Carthage, all of Libya up to Cape Fair, Sardinia and Carthaginians holding in Sicily, and the Carthaginians ensured fair dealings by means of a state guarantee. The treaty shows that they regarded Sardinia and Libya as belonging to them, but not Sicily, for which they explicitly made quite different provisions in the sense that the treaty covers only those parts of Sicily that were ruled by Carthage. Likewise, the Romans had the treaty cover only Latium and made no mention of the rest of Italy because it was not yet part of their domain. Later, They entered into another treaty valid for Tyre and Utica as well as Carthage, in which Mastia and Tarsus was added to Cape Fair as the limits beyond which the Carthaginians forbade the Romans to pass on raiding or colonizing expeditions. The treaty reads more or less as follows: There shall be friendships on the following conditions between the Romans and their allies and the people of Carthage, Tyre, and Utica and their allies. 1. No Roman shall pass Cape Fair, Mastia, and Tarsus for the purposes of piracy or trading or colonization. 2. If the Carthaginians capture any city in Latium not subject to Rome, they shall surrender it to the Romans, but they may keep their valuables and prisoners. 3. If any Carthaginians capture anyone who is covered by a written peace treaty with Rome but is not a Roman subject, they shall bring the captives into Roman ports. But if they do, and a Roman lays hold of a captive, he is to be freed. The same shall apply to Romans too. If a Roman takes water or provisions from any land governed by Carthage, he shall not make use of these provisions to harm anyone who is covered by either a peace treaty or a treaty of friendship with the Carthaginians. The same shall apply to Carthaginians too. No case of infringement shall be liable to private prosecution. Any case of infringement shall be treated as a crime against the state. In Sardinia and Libya, no Roman shall trade or found a settlement and shall remain on land only for as long as it takes to gather provisions or repair a vessel. If he is driven there by bad weather, he shall leave within 5 days. 6. Within Carthaginian territories in Sicily and in Carthage itself, a Roman may do and sell anything that is not permitted to a Carthaginian citizen. The same applies to a Carthaginian in Rome. Again, in this treaty, the Carthaginians stressed their claim to Libya and Sardinia and denied the Romans any landing rights there, but made quite different provisions for Sicily or the bit of it that was subject to them. The Romans did too much. The Romans, too, did much the same for Latium, and they forbade the Carthaginians to harm Ardea and Antium, Circe, and Terracina, the cities that comprise the coastal stretch of Latium with which the treaty was concerned. And then there was a final treaty between the Romans and the Carthaginians at the time of Pyrrhus' invasion before the start of the Sicilian War. And in this treaty, they retained all the terms of the previous treaties, but appended the following. If either the Romans or the Carthaginians enter an alliance against Pyrrhus, they shall both have it stipulated in writing that it shall be permissible for either of them to help the other in the other's territory at a time of war. Whichever of them requires help, Carthaginians shall provide ships for transport on the way there and the way back, while both sides shall provide pay for their forces. The Carthaginians shall, if necessary, help the Romans at sea as well, but no one is to compel the crews inland against their will. The oaths they were obliged to swear as follows. For the first treaty, the Carthaginians swore by their ancestral gods, and the Romans swore their traditional oath by the Jupiter stone for the latter treaties. The Romans swore by Mars and Quirinus. The ceremony of swearing by the Jupiter stone is as follows. Whoever is swearing to the treaty takes a stone in his hand, and after confirming the oath with the state seal, he speaks as follows. May blessings attend me if I abide by my oath, but if I by thought or deed I break it, may all others remain secure in their homelands, protected by their own customs and laws, and living by their own homes, temples, and tombs, while I alone am cast out as now the stone is cast. And with these words he throws the stone. Since these treaties exist and are preserved even now on bronze tablets beside the temple of Capitoline Jupiter in the treasury of the Aediles, there are good grounds for being surprised by Philinus' account. What is astonishing is not his ignorance of these matters. It was still the case in my day that very elderly Romans and Carthaginians, people who had a reputation of interest in political matters, knew nothing of this. But we can legitimately wonder what his basis was for boldly asserting something quite different. That there was a treaty between the Romans and the Carthaginians, which obliged the Romans to keep away from all Sicily and the Carthaginians from all Italy. How did he come to state explicitly in his second book? That was the first Roman crossing to Sicily was a breach of this treaty and a violation of their oaths, when there never has been, nor is there now, any sign of such document. I mentioned this issue in the introduction to my work, but now was the time to elaborate. So many people have been led astray by relying on Philinus' history that it demanded a more thorough discussion. Now, where the crossing to Sicily is concerned, I think to be fair to find fault with the Romans and criticize them for having accepted the Mamertines as their allies in the first place, and then for having responded to their appeals by sending help. These were people who had dealt treacherously with both Messina and Rhegium. But it is sheer ignorance to suppose that the crossing violated oaths and treaties. At the end of the Sicilian War, then, they made a fresh treaty, the main clauses of which were as follows. The Carthaginians are entirely to evacuate Sicily and all the islands that lie between Sicily and Italy. The allies of each party shall be immune from offenses by the other. 3. Neither party shall impose tribute in territory governed by the other party, nor undertake publicly funded construction work, nor hire troops, nor make alliances with the other party's allies. Carthaginians are to pay 2,200 talents within 10 years and another 1,000 talents immediately. The Carthaginians are to return their prisoners of war to the Romans free of ransom. Then later, at the end of the Libyan War, the Romans again decided to go to war against Carthage and, as I have already said, added the following supplement to the treaty. The Carthaginians are to evacuate Sardinia and pay an additional 1,200 talents. Then, the last of this sequence of treaties was the one entered into with Hasdrubal in Iberia with the clause, "The Carthaginians shall not cross the river Ebro for military purposes." These were contractual obligations of Rome and Carthage in relation to each other from the earliest times up to the time of Hannibal. I conclude then that in taking an army across to Sicily, the Romans did not contravene any treaty, but by the same token there was no reasonable pretext or justification for the Second War, the one that led to the treaty about Sardinia. There can be no doubt that it was an act of sheer injustice to take advantage of the Carthaginian situation and compel them to evacuate Sardinia and pay an additional 1,200 talents. It is true that the Romans had accused the Carthaginians of crimes against merchants sailing from Italian shores during the Libyan War, but this situation was resolved when they recovered all those whose ships had been impounded at Carthage and in exchange gave the Carthaginians free of ransom. All the prisoners of war they still had. I had given a more thorough account of this in the previous book. Given all this, my next task is to try to decide, after a thorough explanation and investigation of the issues, which of the two sides should be held responsible for the Hannibalic War. I have already described what the Carthaginians said at the time, and now I shall give an account of the Romans' response. Not that they gave this response at the time because they were too angry at the destruction of Saguntum, but one hears it often from many people in Rome. First, they said, the treaty with Hasdrubal could not just be dismissed, as the Carthaginians high-handedly maintained, because, unlike the treaty drawn up by Lutatius, it included no rider to the effect that this treaty shall be valid if it is accepted by the Roman people. Hasdrubal was acting with full authority when he entered the agreement, one of the clauses of which the Carthaginians shall not cross the river Ebro for military purposes.